Contenti di ospitare qui nel corso di perfezionamento in teoria critica, diretto da Vittorio Morfino, Bob Jessop. Bob Jessop è uno dei nomi più significativi della sociologia e della teoria politica contemporanea. Insegna sociologia all'Università di Lancaster, è noto per i suoi contributi inizialmente sulla teoria dello Stato, quindi sulla governance critica, sull'economia politica critica, particolarmente significativi i suoi contributi sulla École de la Régulation e negli ultimi tempi anche per i suoi contributi sulla Cultural Political Economy. In queste ultime 2 settimane è stato visiting professor all'Università di Bergamo. Elencare le sue pubblicazioni probabilmente prenderebbe qualche giornata, quindi mi limito solo ad alcuni volumi. Tra gli ultimi, State Power del 2007, Congiling Sum Towards a Cultural Political Economy, Putting Culture in its Place in Political Economy, e poi un volume recentissimo di 2 anni fa, di cui è curatore, Culture finanziarie e dinamica della crisi, Financial Cultures and Crisis Dynamics, di 2 anni fa, e The State, Past, Present and Future. Oggi presenterà una relazione sul Variegated Capitalism, che credo sia un suo contributo, una sua categoria, nel mercato mondiale. Il mercato mondiale è evidentemente una categoria di Karl Marx, ma questo ce lo spiegherà meglio Bob Jessop.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm going to begin with a story about variegated capitalism. Niling Sum and I were part of a European Union financed project led by Frank Moulert, who's Belgian, and we were each asked to contribute what they called spot papers, papers on particular themes. And Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore, who are economic geographers, were asked to write on varieties of capitalism, and I was asked to be the commentator, and this was in Hong Kong, a day even hotter than this. And they read their paper, they had a PowerPoint, and I got really excited as the commentator because their paper referred to varieties of capitalism and to variegated capitalism. And as my comment, I said I thought this was one of the most brilliant and innovative papers I had read on varieties of capitalism in over 10 years. And they looked at me completely confused, because they said in reply they'd used variegated capitalism only because they got bored with writing varieties of capitalism, and they didn't know that there was a difference between varieties of capitalism and variegated capitalism. But I could see a difference and got very excited. And this is the paper that you've been circulated, is the very first attempt by me to address the distinction between varieties of capitalism, world systems theory, and variegated capitalism, which, if you like, is the third way or the third category. It looks at varieties of capitalism in the context of the world market. What I want to do today, in the time available, is to present an argument for the concept of variegated capitalism. But I see this concept in the Hegelian sense of Aufhebung. I'm not saying we shouldn't study varieties of capitalism. I'm not saying we shouldn't study the world market, but I am arguing that the world market has to be understood as something that emerges out of the interaction between different varieties of capitalism. And that part-whole relationship is an emergent one, but it means that as varieties of capitalism develop, they're transformed by their integration into the world market. So if you want to leave now, your takeaway point is that there is a legitimate area of study, varieties of capitalism. There's a legitimate area of study, world market. But we would understand both better by introducing and developing the idea of variegated capitalism. So let me see if we can move on. Yes. So this is the outline. I'm not sure whether I'll get to the end, but I always circulate the PowerPoint through the organizer afterwards, so you don't have to get out your mobile phones, take photos and so forth. You'll get the PowerPoint, concentrate on the message. So varieties of capitalism clearly invites the question, capitalism, what capitalism? And the first point I want to make is almost all of the literature on varieties of capitalism fails to define capitalism. It takes it for granted. And when you look a bit further, they don't have very good definitions. It's almost taken for granted that we know what capitalism is. And I think the Marxist perspective that leads us to study the world market, or the variegated capitalism perspective, requires that we have a definition of capitalism. I'm then going to talk about analytical strategies that have been adopted to study varieties of capitalism. And again, each of them contributes something. I'm not saying one and only one is the right method, but we need to know the limits of each method. Then I'm going to look at the varieties of capitalism literature, which, if you know it at all, you probably know in terms of Hall and Soskis, 2001. But actually, there's been a long-standing interest in varieties of capitalism. If you go back even to the 16th and 17th century, different economies, urban economies, national economies, continental or imperial economies are busy comparing what are they doing right, what are we doing wrong, what can we learn from them in terms of best practice. And you can see that very clearly in the development of the other canon of political economy analysis, which takes capitalisms seriously. If we look even just at the post-war world, you have the work of people on modern capitalism about les 30 glorieuses. Why isn't there a crisis after 1945? What are we doing right? And then you get a literature on crises and crisis management and why neo-corporatist methods are better to manage. In other words, the Scandinavian economies, Germany and Anglo-American economies. And then you get the crisis of social democracy, and you get interest in the turn towards neoliberalism and why some countries go down a neoliberal road and others don't. And then you get the varieties of capitalism literature. And each of these focuses on different aspects of capitalism to address a contemporary problem. And it's shaped, that literature is shaped by that conjuncture. So one of the most interesting things, as we shall see about Hall and Soskis, is they wrote during the period of the Great Moderation, what the governor of the Bank of England called the nice years, where nice doesn't just mean isn't it nice, it means non-inflationary constant expansion. So basically they had assumed away crisis tendencies, and they also assume away finance because they're looking at the organization of industrial capital, manufacturing. They're looking at firms. So that's the varieties of capitalism literature, briefly. Then I'm going to look at the exact opposite. Varieties of capitalism literature is generally accused of methodological nationalism. That is to say, looking at national economies as if they exist in isolation. And the world systems approach is the exact opposite. You can only understand a particular economy in terms of the overall logic of development of the world system, and that logic is prior to individual national economies, center-periphery, semi-periphery relations. And I see those as the poles that the variegated capitalism approach tries to transcend by taking some elements from varieties of capitalism, some elements of world systems theory, and putting it in the context of Marx's analysis of the world market, which, as Ricardo would put it, is both the presupposition and the posit of capitalist development. But the presupposition world market and the posit world market, conceptually, historically related, but very different. And I want to focus not so much on world market as presupposition, but world market as theoretical posit and empirical posit. Then I'm going to introduce the idea of variegated capitalism, then compare varieties of capitalism with, which is usually abbreviated VOC, and variegated capitalism I'm abbreviating as VARCAP. No copyright attached to that. And then I'm going to look at variegated capitalism in the world market. And I think one of the most interesting ideas, if we get there, is the idea of incompossibility. And that comes from natural theology, and particularly from Spinoza and others. And it's the idea that not everything that is possible is compossible. So a thing studied in isolation might be imaginable, but that thing in conjunction with several other varieties of capitalism starts to become incredible. And I think one of the biggest contributions of the idea of variegated capitalism in the world market, it blocks you from thinking the United States is doing very well, let's become the United States. China is doing very well, let's become China. That there are in fact limits in terms of a space of possibilities of how many economies can be like each other. It completely undermines the idea there is a single best practice. We have to look at the location of different economies within the world market and the contradictions, the possibilities that come from that. And then if there's time, there's conclusions. This, of course, this little picture indicates one idea of variegated capitalism in the world market, the American millionaire, China in the background, and some people claim incorrectly that the biggest economy in the world is Chimerica. Not China, not the United States, but the pathologically codependent relationship between the United States and China. Actually, the biggest economy in the world, Ricardo will tell you, is the transatlantic economy of North America and Europe, and we can look at their relations of possibility and compossibility as well. So that's the outline. Now let's see how we get there. So capitalism, which capitalism? As I said, the varieties of capitalism literature usually take capitalism for granted as a definition. And it's actually quite challenging to do that. And this is a quotation from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated defy definition. Only something which has no history can be defined. Well, we know that capitalism has a history, it has a genealogy, it gets established, it transforms and so forth, making it difficult to define capitalism. And I've never found the source for this, so I'm describing it as an apocryphal question. But I heard somewhere that Marx was once asked, after Capital Volume 1 came out, he was said, well, your book is called Capital, but you don't define capital anywhere. And his answer was, the whole set of books is going to define capitalism. Don't be too keen to look for the answer now. I teach a course on capitalism and crisis. I also teach Weber, but he has a very different understanding of capitalism, quite a sophisticated one, but looking at the capitalist spirit. And then Schumpeter, again, a different definition. So even if we wanted to talk about varieties of capitalism, You could have a Schumpeterian approach, a Marxist approach, a Weberian approach, and indeed you do get them at a relatively high level of abstraction. In terms of analytical strategies, I'm going to go through this quickly. You can look at it in more detail later. You'll get taxonomy, and my favorite state theorist after Gramsci is Nikos Poulantzas, and he once criticized the taxonomic fury that you find in many political science approaches. So you're classifying for the sake of classifying, and you produce more and more categories, and it gets more and more difficult to understand what's going on. And if you take corporatism, for example, in the end, every economy in the 1970s was corporatist, and you had to qualify it by putting an adjective in front: state corporatism, neo-corporatism, cooperative corporatism, and so forth. And there's a danger there. Then you get heuristic typologies, which use quite short distinctions. So the Hall-Suskis approach is a very good example. You've got coordinated market economies, and you've got liberal market economies. Germany illustrates one, the United States illustrates the other, and then there are hybrids. You can do it statistically. You run all the data, whatever that data might be, through the computer, and it identifies clusters, and that is based more on the mathematical models than on theoretical work. And then, this is where I'd locate myself, from a Marxist perspective, theoretically guided reconstruction of actual cases, where you have to start while sifting. You start with concepts, you don't start with facts, and then you develop the concepts up to the extent that you want then to understand, compare the relationship between different varieties of capitalism. Now, this picture is quite deliberate. This is the methodological nationalism involved in varieties of capitalism. Each capitalism treated as if it was self-contained, trying to identify the specific properties of this model, that model, another model. So a pluralistic logic, lots of varieties of capitalism, based on at least two, often more varieties of capitalism, each with its own dynamic. Coordinated market economy, Germany; market liberal economy, the United States. This is how that model works, that's how that model works, treated in isolation, one from the other. Perhaps a bit more competitive, which brings the outside in, but the competitiveness then is explained in terms of endogenous factors and not in terms of the system. They're treated as path dependent, and they survive, they're coherent, they work, they avoid crises because of the institutional complementarities, for some even the institutional isomorphism of these systems. And if there is a global dynamic, it reflects not only the economic logic, profit-oriented, market-mediated accumulation, but institutional competition as well. So a great part of the answer to why are we performing badly is we need institutional transformation. Nyling and I spent some time in Denmark, and they were very upset. They were quite low down in terms of indexes of competitiveness produced by Michael Porter, the Institute of Management Development, and so forth. And they were surprised because they actually were a happy country and doing quite well. So they came up with an index of institutional competitiveness. And Denmark was number 1. Finland was number 2. Sweden was number 3. So depending how you play the game, you can see different modes of competitiveness, but that institutions matter. Now, there are a lot of slides here on what's wrong with the varieties of capitalism literature, and I'm going to be focusing on Hall and Suskis. To consider the others would take too much time. So a few points that I'm going to pull out about varieties of capitalism literature in relation to Hall and Suskis. They view private and public banks mainly as intermediaries in the allocation of capital to profitable non-financial activities, a very traditional, almost neoclassical understanding of the role of finance. David Soskice, Peter Hall didn't mention it, but David Soskice was very upset when the so-called global financial crisis broke out. I call it the North Atlantic financial crisis. It helped to locate the blame. He says, I don't know what went wrong, but we seem to have entirely missed the role of financialization in our analysis of varieties of capitalism. And it's certainly true. It's a firm-centered approach focusing in on profit-producing capital and ignoring finance. And that, I think, is related to the Great Moderation. This work was done during the Great Moderation when apparently the system was stabilized and capitalism was going on perfectly happily. And this is the point I'm making here. It evolved during the Great Moderation, so it had a very benign view that capitalisms aren't really crisis-prone if they get the institutions right. And there are two ways of getting the institutions right. Because it adopts a historical or sociological institutionalist approach, it never asks the bigger question, what is the capital relation? So it takes capitalism for granted, and indeed it would be almost a Weberian analysis, because for Weber, rational capitalism is profit-oriented, market-mediated orientation to gain, based on the rational organization of capitalist production, and based on rational speculation in financial markets. Very prudent. They would be hedging in Minsky's terms, not speculation or Ponzi finance. And what it does, it doesn't tell you what is generic to capitalism. Now, if you're a Marxist, you know there are generic crisis tendencies. If you focus in on institutions, even if there are crises, they're due to institutional failures and not to more general crisis tendencies. I'm not saying that every crisis can be subsumed under the crisis-prone laws of motion of capitalism, but what institutions do is to mediate or modify the generic crisis tendencies and add some of their own. If you've completely written capitalism out of the script and you're only interested in how institutions vary, there's a lot that you can't understand. The other problem is that they have a very short-term time focus. It's how markets adjust, not long waves of capital accumulation, creative destruction and so forth. There's an assumption that things are normal and continue to be normal, and you explain that in terms of getting the institutions right. And we can contrast that with a Marxist view of capitalism. We have an expert here, so I'm not sure whether you'll agree with me, but this is my summary on one slide. It could be made bigger, of what's distinctive about capitalism and therefore what gets missed in the varieties of capitalism literature. The opening sentence of chapter 1 of volume 1. Why is it that in social formations dominated by the capitalist mode of production, wealth assumes the form or takes the form of an immense accumulation of commodities? So commodities at the center. The commodity form is generalized to labor power, which is a fictitious commodity but treated as if it were a commodity. The varieties of capitalism literature completely naturalizes the capital-labor relation. There's nothing unusual about it. People work, they get paid. That's the way the world is. It never questions why labor is performed in this particular type of relationship, why goods and services are produced as commodities. It focuses on the duality of labor power as concrete labor and labor time. I'm sure Ricardo will say something about that later. It is a political economy of time. People say Marx was the first theorist of globalization. May or may not be true, but he was the first person, as Daniel Ben Said says, Henrik Grossman says, who took the temporality of political economy so seriously. And Daniel Ben Said follows Henrik Grossman in saying, if you look at Marx's work, It is absolutely full of categories to do with the times of capital accumulation, the times of production, the times of circulation, turnover, and so forth, which opens up a whole series of abstract possibilities for crisis, and as Moishe Postone also notes, creates a treadmill effect. You're continually competing to stay in the same place. Has a key role for money as a social relation in mediating profit-oriented, market-mediated accumulation, but there's a lot more that could be said about money in another context. Essential role of competition and a recognition that markets fail. Most of that is missing from the Varieties of Capitalism literature, partly because it developed as anti-Marxist, but also because they didn't bother to read Marx. They all know that it's so impenetrable, it's a good idea not to read it, and if you do read Marx, read the Communist Manifesto, which is absolutely useless for understanding varieties of capitalism or indeed capitalism. And I'm going to skip that. Am I? No, I'm on the Marx quote, which is the importance of actually taking the world market seriously, but we'll come back to that. So the most developed mode of existence of the integration of abstract labour with the value form is the world market, where production is posited as a totality together with all its moments, but within which at the same time all contradictions come into play. And I think posited there means presupposition posit. This is an emergent effect of the development of the world market. And so the question then is, does this mean convergence around a common mode type or variety of capitalism, which is what neoclassical theorists and many others suggest? There is a best practice, and through competition we're all going to converge on that. Or is this where production is posited as a totality together with all its moments, all its contradictions, mean the intensification of contradictions between varieties of capitalism and so forth? And I'm going to argue later for a second. So the intensification of all of the contradictions. What are those contradictions? I start out again from the first page of Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1. Why is this a world of commodities? And the commodity, the value form of the commodity includes a contradiction between exchange value and use value. And one of the things that I do with this is to say that's only one example of the contradictions in capital. And we can think of other contradictions. So is the wage a cost of production or a source of demand? Answer both. Is money a national money legal tender, or is it international currency? And what I've got here, I'm not going to go into all of the details, is a replication of the contradictions in the commodity, re-specified the different forms of the capital relation. And it's not even just that, there is another, and one could continue, and this is one of the things I'm working on at the moment, is productive capital abstract value in motion, or a stock of specific assets to be valorized in a specific time and place under specific conditions? Again, the answer is both. Is knowledge intellectual property or intellectual commons? Again, the answer is both. What does this mean? Well, they're not so fundamentally contradictory that capitalism collapses. So what I do in my work is to say any fundamental contradiction is also a strategic dilemma. When you're trying to regulate, to regularize, to govern the economy, do you treat the wage mainly as a cost of production or as a source of demand? Do you treat money mainly as national money or as international currency? And one of the ways that I differentiate what varieties of capitalism people call varieties of capitalism is which contradictions they take as fundamental for regulating and which side of the contradiction they take as fundamental. So if we take the classic example of Atlantic Fordism and the Keynesian welfare national state, the two primary contradictions they're trying to manage is the nature of the wage and the nature of money. So because Fordism is very productive, productivity takes care of itself, so you can focus on managing the wage and the social wage as a source of demand. And because you have relatively closed economies, you can treat money as a national money and not worry too much about the capital account and so forth. But with growing internationalization, the possibilities of a Keynesian welfare national state within the framework of relatively closed Fordist economy is undermined, and increasingly the wage appears to be a cost of international production, including the social wage. We can no longer afford it, and it's no longer possible to manage the economy as if it were relatively closed, the Mitterrand experiment. You can't have Keynesianism in one country any longer, and you're also subject to a whole series of other pressures. So I'm happy to discuss varieties of capitalism, but only on the basis of a Marxist analysis of how different varieties of capitalism manage the fundamental contradictions of the capital relation and adopt different solutions to how you deal with the strategic dilemmas. And one of the implications of that in terms of compossibility is not every country can treat the wage only as a source of demand or only as a cost of production. For every export-oriented economy, there has to be an importing economy. For every dominant monetarily hegemonic economy, the United States, the dollar, there have to be those that are in the shadow. So adopting this approach both gives you a way of bringing capitalism back in a serious way, and also bringing in ways of thinking about the varieties, or in my terms, variegation of capitalism. We can then use this set of contradictions to criticize the varieties of capitalism literature. So what they look at for the commodity, they're looking at the asset specificity of use value and price formation of particular commodities. They're interested in how you design the labor market. They're interested in how you bring about skilling, retraining, vocational education. They're interested in the core competences of the firm. They're interested in assets, capital as assets to be valorized in a particular time and place, in Germany or the United States or Sweden or somewhere else. Knowledge is only human capital, human investment in human capital. The state is an efficient solution to coordination problems. The implication is they miss the other side of the contradiction. So they tell us nothing about capital in general as available to be invested elsewhere. They don't tell us about abstract labor or general intellect and so forth. So it's very one-sided analysis, a one-sided focus on the most substantive and material aspects of the social relations of production at the expense of the side that is not one-sidedly emphasized by Marx, but brought into dialogue with the more substantive aspects. Now I'm going to turn to Wallerstein on the modern world system. I'm choosing Wallerstein rather than Arrighi, because I think Arrighi is already moving towards an idea of variegated capitalism. So poor Immanuel Wallerstein, as a pioneer, gets kicked a little bit more than Giovanni Arrighi. I'm not saying that because I'm in Italy, but because the Wallerstein illustrates the point better. So a single logic of capital based on economic and military competition among capitalist powers to capture surplus however generated. The key thing is there is a logic at the level of the world system. Not a posit in the way that Marx puts it, but there is a pre-existing logic. There has been for 500 to 600 years. Exploitation occurs at the world scale, and above all through unequal exchange, through trade, based on a division of the world into centre, semi-periphery, and mobility. And the mobility in the world system is shaped on a global level by economic and military competition. And you've got an internal differentiation. So you've got Wallerstein and Andre Gunder Frank, who look at the long history of the world system, starting with mechanicalism. Arrighi has a more sophisticated, I think, periodization in terms of hegemonies, whether finance is more important, industrial capital is more important, etc. But all of them are stressing the world system logic. Very briefly, Wallerstein, 3 volumes, A World System as a Social System with Boundaries, Structures, Member Groups, Laws of Legitimation. So he's focusing on the logic of the world system, not something that emerges out of the interaction of different national varieties, regional varieties, Asia's, Africa's, Europe's. He proposes the world system as a single capitalist system, 3 parts, a dynamic changing system, but the changes are dictated by the logic of the single world system. There's a territorial division of labour, and the focus is on the exchange of goods and services. Almost production is written out of the script because that varies so much between core, periphery and semi-periphery. Based on trade, so it's a commercial focus, and peripheral countries, I've already said, exploited by the whole system, not by one or another imperial power. And the 3 parts, a core with a strong state, competing economically and militarily, and as a result of what one might call social imperialism, having a relatively good time because of its dominant position. A developed semi-periphery with a lot of mobility, declining powers, ascending powers, and then the periphery. The positions are a constant, the occupants can change. And this I borrowed from one of Neiling's lectures, but I think you borrowed it in turn from somewhere or other. It's the logic of the system at the level of the world market. And again, just as with varieties of capitalism, there is, if you like, a rational kernel to this. That there is, after all, not just a pluralistic logic of competing national varieties of capitalism. They are interacting. But whether they're interacting in a world system which already has a pre-given logic, and where nothing changes over time except who's in the core and who's in the periphery and who's moving into or out of the semi-periphery, would be a different matter. Which brings me back to Marx, the quotation I've already given you, but now with a good picture of Marx. The most developed mode of existence of the integration of abstract labour with the value form is the world market, a place in which production, and we actually say the circuits of capital, are posited as a totality with all their moments, within which at the same time all contradictions come into play. And this, for me, is the killer quotation from Marx. There's always a killer quotation. You choose your quotation depending what you want to say. This comes from Marx and Engels in The German Ideology, written in 1845 to 46. The movement of capital, though much accelerated, still remained, however, relatively slow. The splitting up of the world market into separate parts, each of which was exploited by a particular nation. So this is a reference to colonialism and imperialism, and not just to self-contained national economies. The exclusion of competition among themselves on the part of nations, the clumsiness of production itself, and the fact that finance was only evolving from its early stages greatly impeded circulation, or one could say greatly impeded the integration of the world market. If the varieties of capitalism literature were written in the 1840s, you would think, okay, it makes sense given the lack of integration of the world market. But the varieties of capitalism literature has been written in the 1990s, the 2000s and later, when many of these factors that Marx and Engels describe as obstacles to the integration of the world market have been removed. Indeed, one of the ways I approach neoliberalism is it's an attempt on a global scale to complete the integration of the world market. There are lots of obstacles to that. it's not succeeded. But the more that one takes the world market seriously and sees the extent to which it's now much easier for it to become integrated, the more important it is to see how the splitting up of the world market into separate parts is no longer separate parts that evolve in isolation, but separate parts that evolve in their forms of structural coupling, co-evolution, mutual influence, and so forth. And this is the summary table. Another one, again, I won't go into all of the details. The difference between now varieties of capitalism, again, on the left, and variegated capitalism on the right. Varieties of capitalism may not be methodologically nationalist, but it does look only at local, regional, or national models in their own terms, seen as rivals to each other. Variegated capitalism says perhaps there are some complementarities. Perhaps the way in which South Korea and India produce large numbers of mathematicians, engineers, and so forth is very good for the United States, which doesn't. It produces lots of business managers and financial whiz kids and so forth. And so we can think about the complementarities between systems and not each one independently as rivals. The varieties of capitalism literature focuses on forms of internal coherence. These are the institutional complementarities that make this model work. The approach of Marx or any other radical heterodox economist would be saying, if I see relative stability somewhere, I have to ask who's paying the price for that. One of the points that the very early literature, I think Michael Davis said about Fordism. Fordism in the United States looks very nice and working very well. But one of the preconditions, this is also Chris Freeman, for Fordist expansion, is ever increasing supplies of increasingly cheap oil. What does that mean? Military dictatorships in the Middle East. And one can multiply those examples. So if you see a stable economy, don't think it's stable because of its internal coherence. Also say, what are the external conditions that make this possible? It's an invitation to explore colonialism, imperialism, and so forth. Don't just look at short-term temporal rhythms. That's what the VOC literature does, ignoring their relation to the global dynamic of capitalism, but analyze how each variety of capitalism is shaped by and shapes the dynamics of other varieties in the context of long waves, at least, if not the broader dynamic. And this is I quote George Orwell all the time, all animals are equal, some are more equal than others. The varieties of capitalism literature treats all varieties of capitalism as equal. A variegated capitalism approach would say that some are more equal than others, some are much more hegemonic, some are much more dominant, some are big economies which have a big influence on small economies and so forth. So we can't treat them all as equal, and to study each in isolation we have to look at the hierarchies of power, the periphery, semi-periphery relations and so forth. So this is a quick summary. The variegated capitalism of the world market approach breaks with the pre-given logic of the world system approach, Wallerstein, with some concessions, if that's the right way to put it already, from Carnegie, and studies a more open-ended logic. That quotation I've given to you now twice from Marx, the world market as the posit, as the emergent effect of the interaction. And you understand the world market by working your way through those categories. You have to break with the parsimony of Hall Soskis or all of the other studies that work with just 2 or 3 varieties, and consider other varieties and their interaction, and the mutual, very often asymmetrical constraints that this imposes on each. And the solution I'm suggesting is through the analysis of variegated capitalism in an emergent, changing world market that may exist in the shadow of a dominant variety. So all varieties of capitalism are equal, but some are more equal than others. So we don't have a world system, we don't have varieties of capitalism, but we have variegated capitalism. It's incomplete, it's not yet fully instituted, consolidated world market. The relationship between varieties of capitalism in this evolving, interacting system is provisional, unstable, and is based on, this is a lot of jargon which is unpacked elsewhere, and I think the paper you read, the structural coupling, that's to say that one structure evolves in its interactions with others. The asymmetrical conditioning, all varieties of capitalism equals some more equal than others, and the co-evolution of different but dynamically compossible accumulation regimes, modes of regulation, seen in terms of time, place, and spatial flows. This is a chimera. You'll see the chimera coming up over and over again to express this idea. With some more equal than others, so not a singular logic. Global variegated capitalism evolving in the shadow of the greater structure as one variety over than others. Origi, the Netherlands, then the English, then possibly Germany, then the United States, Japan as number one, South Korea as number two, both exaggerated. China now is the big competitor, and how that alters the scape, the space for the interactions among these different varieties. At a global level, I would say that we're still looking at the evolution of a variegated capitalism in the shadow of neoliberalism. But you brought along a paper on Model Deutschland, and you'll know I can either talk about the global shadow of neoliberalism due to finance-dominated accumulation, the dominance of the United States and finance in the global economy, and the way in which the United States can shape global orders, rolling out its image to the world, and that explains that. Or we could look at the European Union in the shadow of neo-mercantilism, and you've written something with Halevi on that, and other Italian scholars, other people have talked about the European Union is a sort of relatively closed but still open economy, where the logic is dominated not so much by neoliberalism as by the logic of export-oriented capital goods producing German economy. Of course, the way in which that works is you have ordoliberalism for Germany and neoliberalism for Greece. So, but the logic of that scale of organization, of fractal logic, is more the EU in the shadow of neoliberalism. So a virtuous circle of economic growth, competitiveness, social integration, ability to manage crises, facilitated by export-oriented neo-mercantile German growth, how it inserts itself into the European and world markets, based on its forms of specialization and how that works in terms of a hierarchy and core periphery relations in the international division of labor. Now, I've introduced the idea of compossibility. I'm excited by it. Most other people look at me with blank faces and think I've gone completely mad. And now I'm going to explain what incompossibility is. The prey is a play on the idea that it comes actually from natural philosophy, where many people said, if God exists, why is there evil in the world? And the answer was, God has designed the world to maximize good, but that means you also need a little bit of evil. And so the logic is one of not everything that is possible is compossible. You can have a lot of good, but everything can't be good. And my argument, perhaps you don't need to know this, is that if we take this idea that not everything that is possible is compossible, it's our way to understand the logic of variegated capitalism in the world market. Different sets of social relations do or could coexist for time in the same spatio-temporal matrix. Incompossibility, sets of social relations that are conceivable independently of their coexistence and co-evolution become impossible when they're put into the same socio-spatial matrix, and it's a relational concept. So this is the basic logic you can look at varieties of capitalism and say, this is possible in its own terms. So a self-contained economy on an island, let's say the Faroes or the Shetland Islands or something like that, possible on its own or possible as an element. Some things would be impossible as an element. You can't have an export-oriented economy on its own, but you can have it as a set where there are some import-oriented economies. You can have some income possible as a member of a set, but otherwise okay. And then in terms of compossibility, you can have benign or neutral compossibility, which is sustainable, and pathological compossibility, which is unsustainable, which moves over into latent incompossibility. Things are getting so bad, sooner or later there's going to be a smash. And then the explosion. And I use this to explain, you've already seen it, the logic of the European Union. Starts out as compatible Rhenish economies, or compossible. The more and more the European Union expands, the more and more difficult it is. You begin to get not benign compossibility, but the beginnings of pathological relationships, which eventually lead to an explosion. Is there something more there? Yes, and then we see that these things are incompossible. How to interpret that figure? I just interpreted it for you, but when you don't have me here and you look at the PowerPoint, that's the explanation that I've just given you. And these are some examples of how you might think about this. So in terms of compossibility, compossible worlds, corporatism, liberal state, developmental state, capital goods, a whole series of things there, conceivable in their own terms. But could you have a repressive labour regime with endogenous growth and liberal democracy? That would be incompossible. Could you have capital goods, endogenous growth and mass consumption? Not possible. You can put South Korea as a military dictatorship in the top box. You can put Model Deutschland in the bottom box. Now, on the other hand, a repressive labour regime, export-led growth, developmental state, Taiwan, South Korea, or mass consumption, welfare state, endogenous growth, les Trente Glorieuses. But that's in terms of individual varieties of capitalism. You can scale that up to the world order. So a European economic community based on Rhenish models worked. The EU organised in the shadow of a neoliberal market economy, increasingly crisis-prone. The EU organised in the shadow of Model Deutschland, also we see eventually broke down. A quasi-continental liberal market economy, which is what the American Chamber of Commerce, the European Round Table of Industrialists and so forth, what that might work. And
it's a cross-temporal kind of putting.
Yes, you have to bring time in, because at any point in time, it may be that it's only pathologically compossible, and that is not a recipe for long-term survival. Because I gave a lecture on the European Union as incompossible, and somebody who was quite bright, in fact you didn't need to be that bright to ask the question, said, if the European Union is incompossible, why does it still exist? So I had to go back to the drawing board and come up with the idea of pathological compossibility, which breaks down. So the fact that these things exist and coexist doesn't mean that they're going to last forever. It just means the crisis tensions, the contradictions haven't yet accumulated to a break point, and then we get to the latent incompossibility.
The Gramscian moment in which the new world is being born, but the old world is...
the old world is dying, but the new world cannot yet be born, yes. Yeah. What about China as number two? This, I think, it's not just number two, this is number one, and this is number two, as if they exist in isolation. You have to look to see how they relate together. And I got this idea from family therapy, you know, the idea of the pathologically codependent couple, where husband and wife, or girlfriend and girlfriend, or partner and partner would be better off breaking up, but they continue to live with each other, and the more they live with each other, worse things get.
Entangled.
And they get entangled. And my argument is there's a catastrophic symbiosis of the US and the PRC, US overconsumption, Chinese overproduction, plus the debts and the recycling of surpluses and so forth. The basis originally of China catching up and the benefit to the US were getting more and more difficult, which produced the idea of Chimerica, and this is claimed to be beneficial. I've already said it wasn't the largest economy in the world, that's the transatlantic, but I think we need to see it in terms of pathological codependence, therefore becoming increasingly pathologically incompossible, but at the level of latency still. I'm just looking at the time, I've spoken for just under an hour. This is really a separate point, but one of the ways you can understand compossibility is how you put into place spatial temporal fixes. You may have heard of David Harvey's work on spatial fixes, temporal fixes. Arrighi refers to spatio-temporal fixes. I have a slightly different take on this. For me, a spatio-temporal fix is those set of institutions and crisis management arrangements that you put into place that enable you to displace crisis tendencies elsewhere, that's the spatial aspect, or defer them into the future. And a lot of the logic of capital accumulation is displacing and deferring. So inflation is a way of deferring problems. Private Keynesianism is a way of deferring problems, but these are ultimately unsustainable. Pushing your problems out into the third world or emerging economies works until such time as they then enter into revolt, and you get what Chalmers Johnson calls blowback, when the problems you thought you'd exported come back and hit you at home.
Also, as an example, it can be a spatial temporal fix as an institutional fix, like the German let's say market capitalism, but with a neoliberal adjustment.
Or neoliberal adjustment. Yes, Ricardo said I had too many slides, so I've cut out the slide on institutional fix, but the long version you get will have semantic fixes and institutional fixes. So getting the discourses right is quite important to actually hide or disguise contradictions through discourses. Getting the institutions right matters. I was interested at the moment in the spatio-temporal aspects because of the temporal, relational, unfolding nature of compossibility. And now some conclusions. So the structural coupling and contingent co-evolution of varieties of capitalism in the variegated capitalism approach doesn't mean there's a singular logic with unique directionality at the global level. On the contrary, it absolutely excludes the idea that there is an already pre-existing logic of capital on a global scale. It's very much something that emerges out of contingently. So for those interested in contingency and necessity, this brings contingency and necessity in very, very strongly. We explore variegated capitalism as a global ecology, not in the green sense of the word, but what we have is a coexistence of varieties of different capitals on different scales, different temporalities and so forth, and we're looking at their co-evolution as an ecological order in the shadow of one or more dominant varieties of capitalism with its distinctive logic. One of the things I emphasize very strongly is you can apply the same logic on a fractal scale. So you don't always have to start with the logic of the world market. You could say, how does Italy work? Because they're obviously more or less dominant models, more or less dominant ways of handling contradictions and so forth. So how does Italy hold together? Or how does the European Union hold together in terms of this variegated model with some aspects more important than others? And finally, explore the obstacles to the full integration of the world market, because I don't believe that we will ever see a fully integrated world market. There are too many obstacles to that. So the idea isn't that the world market is the terminus ad quem and we're moving there. I see a lot of problems in the completion of the world market, and you only need to think Trump, Le Pen, Brexit, and so forth to see some of the resistances. Part of the obstacles include the persistence of national varieties with very strong public support, popular support, institutional embeddedness. But nonetheless, this is one of the points I made, the more integrated the world market, the less sense it makes to study varieties of capitalism apart from the modalities of their integration, their compossibilities, incompossibilities, and so forth. And ending on a Marxist point, the more integrated the world market, the more the contradictions of capital relation become generalized, the more intense the crisis, the harder it gets to overcome them. And now why the chimera, a mythical beast, but it perfectly illustrates variegated capitalism, because it's not three beasts, it's not one beast. This is a beast that's a hybrid that contains the genetic material of three different animals and interacts, but sometimes fights with itself as well. So I think the chimera is a very good way of illustrating the idea of variegated capitalism, not separate varieties, not a single logic, but something that interacts for periods of time until things get out of hand. And that's I always have to, for a public lecture like this that's being recorded, tell you where I got the pictures from. So I've even met my copyright obligations, and now we can go to a break, I think. And then that's an opportunity for you to talk among yourselves, for Ricardo to catch up with the new PowerPoint presentation, different from the one he received at 3 o'clock this morning, and then we'll have some general discussion. Okay?